Okay. Hello and welcome. We are live. I am once again here with the great TJ Martinell, and we are going to be talking about two battles. And we're also going to just do a little preamble. We're just going to ramble a little bit about current events as well. This broadcast is taking place the night before. I don't know what we call that DC rally. Is it the Stop the Steal rally? Does it have an official name? I don't even know.
Yeah, who knows? Not that's how much I'm following it.
So yeah, that's due to take place tomorrow, and it is now 6:30 p.m. on the West Coast, the left coast, where unfortunately, I actually no, I don't mind living on the west part of the United States. I mind that I live in Seattle, which reminds me, TJ, have you seen the new documentary about Seattle?
Yeah, I heard about. I haven't watched it, but here's the thing. Whatever it's going to say in that documentary is something I already know. It's more that's documentary for people who just are not either paying attention or just aren't aware of how bad things are. So I know about the documentary, but I have not watched it because I feel like it's going to just tell me what I already know.
Fair enough. But you do not reside in Seattle, you lucky bastard. So you don't know. Well, not that you don't know, but I mean, you don't see the carnage, so to speak, on a daily basis, like us, bastards that have to live in what was once a beautiful city, which I think you would admit that Seattle once was a quite beautiful city to live in almost every way imaginable. I mean, talk about picturesque views. You were close to great hiking and skiing, and it had all the culture of a first world city. Symphony and opera, great music scene. Lots of bars and clubs, and it was the hub for the tech sector, starting way back in the 80s with Microsoft. And,
right.
It was really a great town. It was vibrant. It was fun when there was lots of people that moved here from all over the country, all over the world. So at parties, you could meet people from all over. It's very interesting. It's a hub of places like Amazon and Starbucks and, I'm trying to remember all the other big tech places that are here. I think McCall Cellular was back in the Seattle and its surrounding areas were just really great. And to see what has become of this city is really heartbreaking for someone that escaped a shithole city only to move to a place to get away from that and then see it become the thing that you were trying to get the hell away from. It's sad.
Right. I definitely think that Seattle was one of the most beautiful cities, and it had I obviously never liked the politics there, but it used to be, I'd say, far less radical than it's become, and to the point where it's in a death spiral. It's a city that hates itself. I mean, that's really what's going on.
Yeah, that's interesting take on it psychologically. I never thought about it that way, but there does seem to be some of that going on where it seems that the city council literally seems to hate the populace they were elected to govern, and it's doing everything they can to destroy them.
Well, that's what's funny is that the people who elect them, like, they represent the people in the majority of voters in that city. And it's not as if it's not like they had some, I'm trying to think of how to just paint how bad it is, where like this is considered to be normal politics. Like that is these people reflect the values of the people of Seattle. So this is the problem I have with getting upset with government officials or elected officials in a democracy, or at least in a place where you can vote, because they're there only because the majority of voters said that that's what we want. And it's not like there was an ideologically, opposed people usually running against them. So Seattle's it's it goes back to the issue of what is the problem? Is it a people who are being subjugated, or people who are the actual problem? Like people who are unfit to govern themselves. And I think it's the latter with Seattle. There are people that are not fit to. It's a situation where the only I'm not advocating for this. It's just, let them burn. But that's where a dictatorship would be justifiable. Where if some authoritarian came in and said, I'm taking over, we're suspending all your civil liberties because you don't deserve it. But then I would just ask the question, like, why would any guy want to do that? Why would any man want to waste his time? Because he's not, one, it's like, unless it was like how self-preservation, where your option is to control the country or the city, or you're going to be oppressed as well. I'm just saying, like, that's the only solution I would see to solving the problem in Seattle is, like, if the police chief were to like declare martial law, arrest all the Seattle City Council members, and then begin, cleaning up the streets and enforcing martial law, that would quote unquote save the city, but it wouldn't save it because the people of the city would be the first to oppose their own salvation.
Yes, I think I totally get your point. And I don't disagree with it. Just, I guess it's a matter of degree I disagree with. For example, like, let me just give you an example. The documentary, by the way, that I was referencing is called Fighting for the Soul of Seattle. I believe that's it. You can Google something like that and it'll come up. You can watch it on YouTube. It was produced by Como News, which is kind of shocking, which is a local affiliate. I forget which, I don't know if they're ABC or NBC affiliate here in Seattle. And they produced it, which I'm shocking, because the first one they did about called Seattle is Dying, the liberals nearly, their panties got in a huge bunch over that one. And yet they came out with yet another one, which shocks me. But this one you might find interesting just because it kind of covered the CHOP and the Chaz stuff, and the police chief resigning, when I don't know how many people follow the CHOP Chaz thing where they had their own little autonomous zone. They took over the police precinct, that kind of stuff. So it had a little bit of inside baseball that unless you lived in Seattle, you might not really be aware of. You might have just heard of it on the periphery. But one of the things they showed in the documentary was that a lot of these council members, when they were running for office, they didn't voice this kind of rhetoric. Now, some of them did. Like, you have that crazy bitch, the I can't pronounce her name. She's Indian. She's like a devout socialist.
Sawant.
Yeah. How do you say that name? I can't even pronounce her fucking name. But anyway,
her name's Sawant.
Sawant. Yeah. No, she's always been a psychopath. But she doesn't get along with the other council members either. Like, she's the one that she led like a bunch of protesters inside City Hall, and she led another march to the mayor's house in Laurelhurst, which is like I'm trying to think what the equivalent. Laurelhurst is like a really rich area, I guess. Like, if you lived in New York, it would be like the Upper East Side or some it's a very wealthy area in Seattle. Now, of course, it's all these champagne socialists, that live in these areas, right. And that mayor is this same bitch that called it the summer of love, until the shooting started. But my point is that these city council members, they showed clips of their debates, and they were talking about increasing police funding in the debates. Now, when they got elected, they changed their tune, but people are going to vote based on, and there's no real Republican party here, so you can't really vote Republican. They don't even bother fielding candidates.
Right. I mean, this is not a city that is politically divided. It's a very politically. It's just sheer dysfunction. Like, I've seen this at a micro level with families where they hate each other. They don't like each other, but they are united on issues of like, God, what would I say? They will vote. They are very decisive on a specific issue. And I think that has to do with like how things are run or managed. And if you don't even have to call them a republic. It's not about like party. It's about ideology. If you believe that homeless people should not be on the streets, if you believe that that the average law-abiding, tax-paying citizen should be respected and prioritized, that is by definition in that city a right-wing perspective. They have a very specific philosophy, which is that the average person is evil, certain people are victims, and you need to repent through all these various things. It's kind of a religion. And so people internalize that, like they accept that. So if you're a law-abiding, tax-paying citizen, but you believe you're the problem, then you're going to submit to the most dysfunctional, screwed up people. You're going to see them as the leaders. You're going to see them as being righteous and good and noble, and you're evil, and you need to be sanctified by voting for them. And the more they heap crap on you and the more you take it, the more you're demonstrating your piety to the religion. Which is why Seattle. I mean, it's going to get to the point where like we've passed the point where the city is even concerned in a lot of ways. I'm not saying that everybody in the city is bad, but I guess my thought is it's a city that they may not like what's happening, but they don't have the moral courage to stand up to what's going on. So what you're going to see is you're going to see a shutdown, a complete breakdown of civil infrastructure, like like with Flint, Michigan, where the drinking water isn't going to be clean. Which here's what's interesting. I don't know how much you know about this, but actually I take that back. The Cedar River watershed is where Seattle gets its drinking water. They treat that like Fort Knox. There are mountain trails that you can hike on next to it, and they have no trespassing signs. They have security cameras. You cannot go into that area, and it's heavily monitored. And I was like, I'm trying to understand why, because the thing is, that is not the norm. I've canoed across lakes that are used as the water reservoir for other major cities in the Puget Sound area. So you can go up to their watershed. You can even canoe through it. But with Seattle, a city that basically is just like watching itself decay, they are obsessively protective of their water supply, which is really weird. Because I'm like, why don't you just apply that same attitude towards the city itself? That's why I don't. I mean, I almost actually want to do some research on that. Like when, why, how, and not just how it started, but why has that culture of protectiveness remained with the water supply, not the city? You think they'd be like, hey, we can't have homeless encampments in our city. We can't have this stuff going on. It's going to, it threatens this and this and this. Would they tolerate homeless encampments in the Cedar River watershed? No, they wouldn't. But it's also far removed. It's far removed. Well, I'd say two things. I don't know. It's the only way to explain that stuff is psychological. Like there's something psychologically where the city is still willing to say, we don't want anybody near there. Now, of course, people aren't going to do homeless encampments in the Cedar River watershed, but that kind of only highlights the point. It's like we're talking about people who are just hiking through there. They're not poisoning the water supply. They're not camping out near the water. They may just be passing through. So I'm probably going to end up looking that up sometime this week because I'm just wondering like why that culture has remained. I wonder if it would be different if the Cedar River watershed was located closer to the city, because it's located, I think, 30, 40 miles away from Seattle, near North Bend.
Yeah, that's why our water is so freezingly cold here in the wintertime. That's why water. But that's really funny. If you live in Seattle, if like when you take a shower this time of year, you have to have like the tap like on 90% hot. And, and then this, like, if you take a shower in like August, like there's such variability in the tap water temperature, because I remember in New York City, it wasn't like that. But anyway, that's just a aside that I just find funny. Like, that's one of the reasons my electric bill is so much higher in the wintertime, because I actually have a gas fireplace, and I don't pay for the gas. So that I don't pay for that. That's why we heat my apartment. But my electric bill is so much higher because my hot water heater is electric, not gas, and because the water coming in is like just barely above freezing, so it uses up so much electricity. Right. But so anyway, I wanted to say something else about Seattle before we move on. That we're going to discussing the Battle of Hastings, guys. So just tune in. We got 4 listeners so far. Hold on. Someone, Armored Ghost said, forgotten battles, bar brawls in Pottstown with your violently benevolent host, John Steele.
That sounds like a Terror House Meg short story.
Yeah, that's your next title, TJ.
Okay, we'll see what we can do. I'm sure Matt will get a kick out of it if I send it to him.
Yeah. I mean, Terror House. They publish some. What's the website again? Terror House Mag.
Terrorhousemag.com.
Terrorhousemag.com. I didn't want to say Terror House Press. I think that's Terror House Press is the name of the corporation. I think the website is. You can follow him on Twitter, and TJ, you got I think they published many of your. Actually, your novel was published on there, wasn't it? One of your novels.
Yeah, the Pilgrim's Digress. Yeah.
Yes, and a bunch of short stories were published on there as well. But anyway, so
actually,
okay, go ahead.
I'll just throw it out here. The first story I actually ever wrote for Terror House was a short story that takes place in Seattle. It was based on an actual interaction I had with this guy, but it's about the idea of just how the city has become so unaffordable for people who've lived there since the 70s and 60s.
Oh yeah, I mean it's when I first moved here in I think it was November of '93. I don't know if you were even alive then, TJ. But I remember like in the late '90s, because then it was still very affordable. By the way, the early mid '90s, it was affordable. It didn't get obscene until the 97, 98, 99. Then it started just go crazy because of the .com stuff. And Seattle was the hub of all that. Like I mentioned earlier, Microsoft, Amazon, they were all based here. And then you had all these other little companies, you'd have someone who made millions of dollars because they worked at Amazon. So they become these .com millionaires. And then they started their own little company. So then you just had this constant, it kind of started to become exponential. And that continued up until very recently. Even the housing bubble, when it hit, it did hit us, but not to the same degree it did other parts of the country. There was places like Vegas. I remember during the housing bubble where I think they had a 60% decline in home values. That's obscene, man.
Yeah.
Imagine that 60% something is worth only 40% of what you bought it for. We didn't have that. I mean, we got hit, but nothing and also we fully recovered. Now I don't know it's kind of hard to, one of the things I did want to talk about is because TJ does live in Washington State, but I'm not going to say any more where than that. Just it ain't in Seattle, but he lives in a more remote part, which I've been kind of looking into moving to that area. But I understand that the prices are just getting astronomical for people because everybody is thinking the same thing I am, getting out of here. Where are we going to move to? And they all want to move to where TJ is. And I understand TJ's not too happy about that idea.
Well, in some ways, yes and no. It's actually a double-edged sword because my property value is just skyrocketing, and it is probably the best buying this house was the best financial decision I ever made because of just how much the land has accrued equity. The problem with that is so is every other place around me, and so is the entire state. So, people will say, "Oh, you can sell your house and make all this money." Great. Where am I going to buy another house?
Right. Exactly. Yeah. Where are you going to move to? So, in that sense, if you needed the money to, move to, what's that place? Everybody's, oh God, what's that country? Not Belize.
Belarus.
No, it's in South America. It's beautiful.
Brazil.
It was not Brazil. It was a small country. I can't. Oh God, I'm blanking on. I'm having a senior moment here. That's what happens when you turn 50, guys. But anyway, So that's true. I remember the same thing kind of happened in Seattle. People said, my house, because I bought it when it was not a house. It was condominium, but I bought it when real estate was sanely priced, and then I'm also fortunate because I bought my home so long ago. It's completely paid off. I don't know how much of your mortgage you paid down or what, but I'm sure you've refinanced since. So you're probably paying like even your mortgage rate is probably like the percentage. Like I'm not gonna ask you how much your mortgage, but what kind of mortgage rate you're getting. Can you say that?
I'll say I haven't changed anything since I bought the house. But if I was going to, it's something I'm probably going to look at some point in the near future. But I think the issue is that
yeah, sorry to interrupt. Yes, Costa Rica. Yeah. That was it. I couldn't think of it.
Gotcha.
Costa Rica. Everybody was like, yeah, because you can go to Costa Rica. But now, from what I understand, like a ton of Americans have done that. So even there, apparently, you can't live cheap anymore. But yes, thank you, Nexus. Costa Rica.
Yeah, it's a place where you don't have to pay the U.S. income tax.
Yes,
that's why.
And it's also it's a really safe, and the climate is temperate, and it's but apparently all the good spots have been bought up by the uber wealthy.
Well, that's the problem. Like Cle Elum used to be. I mean, when I was growing up, we used to go to the middle of the state all the time, and Cle Elum is this town right off I-90. Well, back when I was a kid, I mean, the town in a lot of ways hasn't changed. But the property value, because all these retirees from Seattle went and bought houses there or second homes. And so Cle Elum itself is still a rural town. And it has this weird disconnect because the housing is so expensive there that it's such a weird dynamic. It's like what's going on in my area where you have these McMansions being built on former agricultural plots. And, down the road a little bit, there's the suspicious looking trailer home that probably is cooking meth or something like that. Like there's just it's such a weird thing. It's kind of like in Bellevue, actually. I could always tell like who had been there before the housing boom because their house would look kind of old paint. You have an old car parked in front of it. It's not the most clean or maintained house. And then right next to it is this mansion that they destroyed the Rambler and put it in a mansion or something like that. And so what a weird disconnect to be this guy, a blue collar middle class guy who bought his house in the 80s for probably $60,000. And now your property's worth $1 million and you're living next to a rich guy. That's where I'm like, I don't have a solution for that problem, but that is a problem when the socioeconomics gets all screwed up like that.
Yeah, and these extreme fluctuations in wealth, like Bellevue. I remember in the late '90s, I had to briefly live in Bellevue for I think 5 months because I had to move out of my place because they were doing construction, and I remember the southern part of Bellevue, that was kind of the more rural part, and there was a lot of that going on there where you'd still have these kind of like borderline trailer parks next to. These McMansion stuff that was going on because it was in transition because there was such a huge influx of wealth that was coming into for those who don't know, Bellevue's like it's a peripheral city of Seattle, so it's there's like we used to call it Barker. What is it? Burien, Auburn, Redmond, Kirkland, Edmonds, Renton, remember all there's all these small cities around Seattle. I mean, I used to try to explain it to my people back east. I said, like, there's Manhattan, right? They go, yeah, okay. Well, think Manhattan's like Seattle, and then you think of the boroughs like Queens, Brooklyn, Staten Island, stuff, like the same thing. Like they're all technically part of New York. That's kind of how it is,
right?
Seattle.
Yeah.
Because technically, Microsoft is in Redmond, right? But everybody.
Right.
Bill Gates lives in Seattle,
Right. So, but it's like with New York, unless you're really familiar, though New York's boroughs are a little bit more famous and distinct. Bellevue used to be the middle class area, and then Redmond was kind of a mixture of rural and techies. But now it's just become one giant, I guess, techie cosmopolitan. Even though I have to say though. I did a story on this for my news site. Bellevue has resisted the cultural changes at a city municipal level because they're going a very opposite direction of Seattle in terms of its, their budgeting and their law enforcement policies and stuff like that. So it will be interesting to see what Bellevue does. This is what I thought was funny is in my book, The Stringers, that you can find on Amazon, I portray a future where Bellevue has overtaken Seattle as like the dominant metropolitan area. It's annexed Redmond, Renton, and other cities. So it's basically the new Seattle because Seattle's been destroyed by an earthquake rather than communism. So I guess I was optimistic in that regard.
We can only dream. Yeah.
Yeah, I'll leave it at that. But so I thought that was interesting how I wrote that book 8 years ago, and looking at how a lot of what I anticipated even then, because this was kind of during the beginning of the Amazon boom. So I hadn't really seen Seattle's peak in terms of its, everything that was going on. But I did think that was interesting because some of the stuff on the book, is a little far fetched, but then you're reading it, it's like, it's kind of playing out that way.
Yeah. Well, that's the interesting thing about the times we live in. Like a lot of things that we would laugh at as being like far fetched. Like now we're like, oh no, I could see that happening. Like, I mean, one of the things I just wanted to mention, like, and we will get to the battle guys. But one of the things I did want to mention was, you're familiar with the bill to decriminalize theft if the theft is based on need.
Oh yeah. Oh, it's gonna. I mean, I don't think Seattleites have for lack of a better word, the balls to do this. But this is how the mob would gain. If I was in organized crime, if I was a mob boss, I'd be moving to Seattle. I'd be setting up shop there. And if they pass this thing, I would just be going door to door to people and saying, look, this neighborhood's under the protection of my family. We're going to come by every, month or so to collect the fee for your protection because, the cops aren't going to protect you.
Excuse me, we call that tribute. It's not a fee.
Yeah, you're going to pay. Yeah, we're going to pay. Yeah, you pay tribute to your protector. And if I was the organized crime boss, I would say, no, we're not going to have crime in this area. And you pay off the cops so they'll leave you alone, or you pay off some city officials. It's like, yeah, outwardly you can say whatever you want, but behind closed doors, here's some money, shut up, and leave us alone. And so the neighborhood's taken care of. You get your protection racket, and I mean people are like, well, I can either risk having crime in our neighborhoods and we can't take our kids to the park because there's used needles and homeless people there, or we can live in an environment where we can have that, but we just have to pay a little bit more and we have to acknowledge a mob boss. I think Seattleites would rather not be able to take their kids to the park than actually acknowledge, because they see what's happening as the moral thing. Like it reminded me of when people were testifying about the Seattle's proposed income tax, and there were techies there, very wealthy people, saying, please tax me. Like, I want to be taxed. And it's like,
Bill Gates actually spent a fortune on an ad campaign trying to put a state income tax. It was a statewide tax they were trying to.
Right. But the thing is, he already has his money. So it's not like that's not a big deal.
Okay. Yeah. I mean,
yeah. But what I thought was funny is when these people are saying, please tax me, please, please, oh, please, hurt me, I deserve to be punished, that kind of thing. I was like, that really explains the psychology of a lot of people in Seattle. They have a lot of this money. They feel guilty about it. They don't want to be seen as the bad guy. So they think that if they do this stuff, they'll be doing penance, and they won't have to actually give up any of their wealth. I don't fully understand their logic or how they're rationalizing this, but I don't think Seattleites would ever tolerate a mob boss going through actually providing them protection. They would allow it if he was just shaking them down and then not providing them any protection at all. I mean, that's how screwed up I think people are in that city, where they don't have a problem with organized crime or gangs. They would have a problem with those gangs for cleaning up their neighborhoods.
No, it's funny you said that, because if you went around and said you have to pay this money to Black Lives Matter because you have privilege, whatever privilege they assign to you, then they would pay the tax. But if someone did it the same way and actually offered you something in return, you're right, they wouldn't. Like that's how screwed up their mentality is. Like they would pay more for Black Lives Matter just to alleviate their self-created guilt than they would pay a tax that actually got them something for it in return, like safety for their children. Does that make sense?
Yeah. I totally agree. I think that and that's why there's like, they're talking about the fight for Seattle's soul. Seattle sold its soul to the devil a long time ago. I think that they passed the point of no return. I mean, when Sawant got elected in 2013, I just realized it was over. In a sense, like, and the fact that she's been continually reelected, and the fact that the city council doesn't have, I can't stand up to them, and the fact that the people see, I don't know. The only thing that I can say to that is I don't want to be around people who have that attitude. Those are the kind of people that will enable criminals, they'll enable druggies, they'll enable the most destructive people in your society and culture, and they will turn on you if you try to fix problems. And they will blame you for those problems that other people created. So you just don't want to be around them.
Right. And also there's no there. What I've learned is they're immune to logic and they're impervious to reason. There's no way you can engage in an intellectually honest discussion with them about the current state of affairs.
Right.
That's my take on it. But hold on. We're going to, you know what? We're going to discuss the Battle of Hastings. So could you set up the battle? I'm putting TJ on the spot here, but to be honest, we didn't have enough time. For those who don't know, my Twitter account has been suspended because I heard some fifis. So wasn't able to communicate with we're actually having to go old school and communicate via email. By the way, I'm gonna have to get your phone number so we can text before this. You can just email it to me whenever you want. But because people checking email now, at least I kind of use email just for work purposes. I don't know about you, but I don't use it like socially anymore.
Gotcha.
But for like work, it's a necessary thing. But anyway, so Battle of Hastings. So we're gonna have to set up the date. We want to set up the date and the political situation. The geopolitical situation of the time of the battle. So go ahead.
Right. So the Battle of Hastings took place in 1066. Just as a very brief, I will genuinely be brief with this. At this time, there was separate parts of England. There was the part that was controlled by the Vikings up in the north, due to all the different raids. So the Anglo-Saxons had invaded prior in England's history, and they formed a single identity that got cemented to the point where, but then they were being ruled by a king called Edward the Confessor. He was known for his piety, but he had no children. And so there was a dispute over who would take over the throne when he died. And there was three main contenders. There was Harold Hardrada. He was the Viking from Scandinavia, actually. He didn't actually live. That was really interesting about the Vikings, the Scandinavians. They didn't actually rule directly from England in a lot of cases. Then there was Harold Godwin. He was the Anglo-Saxon contender for the throne. And then there was William from the Duke of Normandy. He was an illegitimate child, but still managed to get his Duke title. And it's a dispute over what happened, but more or less, Harold Godwin visited him in Normandy. He was held captive. Then he promised that he would give the throne, like he conceded the throne to William, and then went back home in England and said it didn't count because it was made under duress, like it didn't qualify. So
before you continue, I have a couple of questions. Now, from what I know of history, was York was the epicenter of the Viking-held part of England, right? That's in northern England, right?
Yeah.
And at this time, though, had the Viking invaders been fully Christianized at this time?
To be honest, I don't know. I don't think so. I think that the Vikings were still pagan, and they were not seen as part of, like, there wasn't a one island state.
Right.
So there was the different parts up in the north. Right. But by that, I mean, you already had Alfred the Great, who was the Anglo-Saxon king who drove off the great heathen army that was invaded. And so, yeah, so Edward the Confessor dies. Harold Godwin gets crowned king of the Anglo-Saxons, and then he has to deal with two invasions. Harold Hardrada invades from the north. William plans a massive amphibious invasion. Ironically enough, in D-Day we invaded from England into Normandy. Yeah,
invert.
Yeah. It's kind of a brief history background. I actually went to Normandy 2 years ago, and it was very fascinating because they have this dual identity. They were liberated, but they were also conquerors. And so I think that gives the Norman people a much more comfortable identity or footing. Like, they don't have a problem embracing the fact that they were liberated because they also know what it's like to go and conquer areas. So that I just think that doesn't it's not like other areas where they just prefer to not even remember that liberation occurred. So there was the Battle of Stamford Bridge. This is where Harold Hardrada meets Harold Godwin's army up north. Harold Hardrada is killed. I think his brothers is as well. It's a decisive Anglo-Saxon victory. Well, now Harold Godwin has to march his troops down all the way down to Hastings, which is at the very southern part of England, where William the Conqueror, not to give away.
That's why so many British people have the last name Williamson. Did you know that?
Yeah. I mean, it's very fascinating to see how many. Right. So they end up. Harold Godwin encamps his army, and let's go a little bit into the contrast in militaries. The Normans were cavalry. They were mounted horse, and they had this kite-shaped shield. And so their main form of attacking was through cavalry charges. The Anglo-Saxons relied on the infantry shield wall, where they would mass together. This was a tactic that had been used during the Battle of Tours by Charles Martel. That's how he was able to hold off the Muslim skirmishers. They were light cavalry. Muslims didn't have heavy cavalry. As we discussed in the episode on the Battle of Hatton. So Harold Godwin is on top of this hill, and William decides to attack. That they're going to go up that hill. Well, the initial part of that battle was a disaster for the Normans. They got crushed by the Anglo-Saxon infantry. Here's the problem: a lot of Godwin.
I just got a question about that. So you had heavy cavalry got defeated by infantry?
At the Battle of Tours, yes. This what happened is the Muslim cavalry Muslim cavalry were skirmishers, so they would do light, quick attacks, shoot arrows and then they leave. Well, with these shield walls, these small clusters of men, the Muslims ended up having to actually directly attack them. And so they had to win the battle, because they were invading France at the time. And so Charles Martel didn't have to attack. He just had to defend. And also the Muslim army at that point had been so used to winning, the idea that they would lose didn't occur to them. They didn't think that would ever happen. They severely underestimated Charles Martel. But that was an example of where infantry could win against cavalry, but it had to be of a certain type. But since the Anglo-Saxons, the Normans were much more heavily armed, their cavalrymen were much more heavily armed. But the problem is that they had to go up a hill, so you lose a lot of that momentum when you're going up the hill. And the Anglo-Saxon shield wall holds so firm that the Norman army is retreating and in a rout. And so all these Anglo-Saxon militiamen, because a lot of them were not professional soldiers, they broke. They weren't conscripts. They were just people who would. They were like the Minutemen from the American Revolution. They weren't professional soldiers. They were farmers, or they were whatever that were called up for service in times of need. But they weren't professional year round, like some others were, because it just cost so much money. Well, they aren't as disciplined. So when they see the Normans running, they break from the shield wall, which was a big no-no. Like, the whole concept of the shield wall is you never break for any reason, because that. Right. Well, they break ranks and they are chasing after the Normans. Well, finally, William the Conqueror rallies his troops, and they turn, and then they completely slaughter the Anglo-Saxon militiamen who've been attacking them, because now they're on flat ground and they are not protected by their shield wall.
Right. Well, they gave up. So they did two critical errors. They gave up the high ground.
Yeah.
And they didn't maintain the shield wall. Okay.
Right. And the important thing to remember with this battle that I'm assuming Harold Godwin understood, but maybe his men didn't, they did not have to win the battle. They just had to not lose, because they're in a position where they're in their country defending their land. William the Conqueror is attempting an invasion. And so if he doesn't win the battle, he has to go home. He can't stay behind, or he can't stay there indefinitely. And he's not in an area where he can get a lot of supplies. It took a lot of resources to get these troops out to where they are. But at this point, then William realizes that like he understands how to win this battle. So he would do these attacks, and then he would do a fake retreat. He would lure men out from the shield wall, and then he would decimate them on the flat ground. And interestingly enough,
so this was kind of by accident. He learned this, like he turned defeat into victory.
Right. And what's interesting is also, this was allegedly William told his troops, you fight not merely for victory, but also survival. Because what would happen is he couldn't, if they lost a battle, they might not even be able to retreat. So I'm reading from a history book that says that his claim in that comment may seem melodramatic, but it was the naked truth. If they failed to defeat the Saxons on hostile English soil, then they would probably not escape home to Normandy alive. So this was kind of an all or nothing for William the Conqueror. What was funny is at one point during the battle, for some reason, there was a rumor going around that William had been killed. So his men started retreating. Well, so he threw off his helmet so that men could see his face, and started charging up and down the battlefield, screaming, "I'm still alive." It was when they were
rallying his troops.
Yeah, rallying his troops. Yeah. And so what ultimately ended up happening is slowly they managed to move up the hill after attack, until finally the Anglo-Saxons were overwhelmed, and Harold Godwin got shot with an arrow in the eye and died. And all but his Huscarls, which were his elite bodyguard, everyone else broke and ran. And so that was, there was still fighting to be done, and there was actually a massacre of Norman troops that were pursuing the retreating Anglo-Saxons. But the battle was over at that point. It was clear who was going to win, and William would be crowned king later. I think it was on Christmas Day or something like that year. So what happened? The effects of this battle. Well, most of the Anglo-Saxon nobility was wiped out during the battle. This was a time when the people who ruled the country actually fought in their battles, right? Who actually had skin in the game. They didn't send other people out to do their fighting. They would be on the ground fighting alongside them. And what that also meant, though, is that it was very easy to replace the Anglo-Saxon nobility with Normans. So basically, Normans just took over all their lands and holdings and stuff like that. And what was interesting about that is William the Conqueror owned it all, and then he distributed it out to different people, but he still maintained a lot of land. If people read the book The Greatest Knight, that's about William Marshall from a couple centuries later, it talks about how over the centuries since William the Conqueror, the king had less and less land to give out as rewards to people, whereas William could just give stuff out like it was Christmas Day because there was so much of it. And that's where actually the Irish, the Fitzgeralds were actually not originally Irish. They were Normans who came over with William the Conqueror, and then they went over into Ireland to go secure parts of the land there. And there's a bunch of other peoples that were their families were originally Norman as well. But what was also interesting is that the nobility got replaced, but the people of England are, to this day, for the most part, if you don't include non-English people in England, most of them are ethnically Anglo-Saxon, or they descend from the original Britons who were there, during the Roman times. Like the Normans didn't really, as an ethnic group, they didn't replace anything. They just took the English people. The joke was they paid the same taxes to a different name, like to a different person, but things didn't necessarily change in that regard. Now, they didn't like the fact that they were being ruled. obviously, by an outsider. They were people who wanted to be ruled by someone from their own, group, their own nation. But that resulted in the a Norman king controlling England along with parts of northern France.
Yes. Now, but from what I guess a prefix to this would be that the Normans themselves were descendants from Viking invaders, correct?
Yeah, that's also what's interesting is Rollo was their he signed some sort of agreement.
Christianized Viking.
Right. They signed some sort of deal where basically that Normandy was recognized as an independent area back then. Like this was when France was not like the Normans also. This was another fascinating thing is how the Normans did not think of themselves as French, and they weren't French,
Right.
but they had a very distinct and different identity and culture and customs from the French people. So this got really interesting during like people talk about Richard the Lionheart and his brother John and stuff. They were all Normans. They were not French, but also they weren't English either. Richard the Lionheart didn't speak English. He spoke some sort of Old French or some sort of a Norman language, but he wasn't English ethnically. He didn't speak English. So it's just really fascinating to see how that identity was a big deal back during that time of that empire, but people wouldn't really see the difference nowadays necessarily, unless you're really looking for it.
Right. Well, yeah, I know there's been some. What's the guy's name? Sykes. I think it's Brian Sykes, the guy that he mapped DNA. Was that his name? Sykes, the guy that did that?
Possibly.
But anyway, they did a lot of work in Ireland and England, mapping out. How do I say? By studying genetics, you can kind of understand human migrations, and
oh yeah.
So it was kind of interesting, like when I think a lot of people knew this, but they didn't have genetic evidence for it, was the genetic similarities between the Irish and the Scottish. Like, they found out that they were genetically distinct from England, specifically Lower England.
Right.
And that was, which is kind of interesting, I thought. I was always interested in the thing about England is it is really a island that its entire history is just all about invasions.
Right. That's what I found. I remember studying history when I was in college, and one of my teachers said it's really fascinating that this island went from being this podunk remote post of the Roman Empire, an island that was helplessly conquered or invaded, and colonized, for lack of a better word, would end up becoming the heart of one of the biggest empires the world has ever seen. The British Empire.
The largest. I mean, it was larger than the Roman Empire. And yeah, you're right, because I mean, it started with the Julius Caesar was the first invader of Britain, and I think it was 3 attempts he made. At one point, I think he was almost going to give up on the idea because they experienced such resistance that it was like financially just not
right.
Whatever. But they eventually, once they got, the way the Romans are, once they got their toehold in there, the Romans were brilliant at the divide and conquer strategy. And so that was one of the reasons they were so good at conquering, was because they would play the different tribes off each other, and which tended to be the nature of the world. Of all the other nations outside of the Roman Empire. Whenever they wanted to expand it, these nations were all individual tribes, and they had trouble unifying, or when they did, it was usually too late.
Right.
And that's how they that's how they were able to conquer Britain, for example. And even they didn't even totally conquer Britain. Like who was it? Hadrian built the wall to keep the Scots out.
Yeah, which it's like, my thought is always, walls are much better. Like if you look at history, walls have always been more effective at keeping people in than keeping them out. Like the Berlin Wall and the boundary wall did a good job of keeping people from leaving. But the Wall of China, they just discovered that all you have to do is just bribe the local guard and he'll open the door for you. Like that's you can build the biggest wall you want, but if you can bribe the guards, with Hadrian's Wall, I don't know the whole history of it, but I just know that it was not very effective ultimately at keeping them out, because it's harder to keep people out than to keep people in that regard. But that just goes to show the difference that England was not this united island at the time, and frankly has never been. There's been different nations there. The Welsh are different, and there's even Cornwall. Some people argue that Cornwall is its own separate nation within. I mean, that's why it's called the United Kingdom rather than England. There's the island of, I think, Great Britain's the name of the island, but I don't think that I think the Welsh would consider themselves British. It was actually kind of funny. So I was in this very like micro pub place in Dover in England a couple of years ago, and it was this place where they didn't allow you to use cell phones. You had to actually talk to each other. Had to actually socialize.
What a
I know, and I mean, surprise! It was a lot of older people and me. I'm this young guy with who has no local currency, and they only take cash. So that made it interesting. But I'm listening to one of them chat, and this they were talking about how there was a Scottish MMA fighter, or boxer, or whatever, and one of them said, well, he's saying he's Scottish, he's not really British, and this like very proper older English lady says, well, he's British whether he likes it or not. So it kind of goes back to identity, but so going to the issue of the Battle of Hastings and what would have happened had William the Conqueror lost, there's two issues: is what would have been the results, and would it have been better or worse for England? I'm not sure who does the Twitter handle for Terror House, but they a couple of years ago they were talking about how when England lost the 100 Years' War, it cut off their contact with the European continent and made them very parochial and paranoid and isolated in terms of their culture, and that's reflective in a lot of their literature since then. What was interesting is that connection to the continent was made possible by the Battle of basically the Norman conquest of England. That's where they had this connection with the rest of with Europe at the time. I think that King Arthur would have remained a very obscure figure. And the reason for that is that King Arthur, through legend, was a cavalryman who led the Welsh or whoever to victory against the Anglo-Saxons. And he wasn't terribly popular, I don't think, obviously, because the Saxons were the enemy at the time in the Arthur legends. But it was the Normans that really popularized King Arthur following their conquest, because he was a cavalryman. He was
Can I interrupt you there? From what I understand, many of the soldiers in William's army, they kind of saw themselves as the embodiment of the Arthurian legend.
Right. This is where the kind of the birth of I don't want to say the birth of the chivalry as an actual institution wouldn't really come about until as an actual meaningful concept until the time of Henry II, who was around the time of right before the Third Crusade is when it really took off. But yeah, there was still that concept. You had the song of Roland that had come out that really expressed the spirit of chivalry as an actual institution, which I've done I've written numerous essays on this whole concept. But they were the ones who really popularized King Arthur because they saw him as one of their own. He was a cavalryman who fought Saxons. So I was reading a introduction to Thomas Mallory's book, Limworth de Arthur, and Robert Graves, who was the guy writing the introduction, said that if Arthur had been a foot soldier, he would probably be not well known just because of that fact. The Normans would have never idealized him because he wasn't, to be a cavalryman meant to be of nobility. Just if for no other reason, just the sheer costs of, having the equipment, the armor, the weapons. You have to have the horse. You have to maintain the horse. You have to feed the horse. Yeah. Well, and also in that book, The Greatest Knight I was reading, it took hundreds of hours to be able to be an effective soldier on a horse, like a cavalryman. So these guys were really the elite of their time, but it came at such a high cost that the only people who are going to be able to afford to do that are people who have money. Only people who have money at the time are the aristocracy and the nobility. But it was also, I don't know if this was adopted precisely at that time, but throughout most of medieval history, you couldn't be a knight. You had to be of noble blood. And now you could be knighted, or I can't remember what it was called, but you could be given the title. But if you came from a commoner's family, you were not going to become a knight in almost any case.
Because you had to plow the fields and everything like that. You couldn't take the time to train. Take, because that would, so yeah, you had to have coin back then to have access to that level of training and at the time to do it.
Right. I think that, one of the interesting not downsides, but when William the Conqueror took over England, he did a census. It's called the Doomsday Book. And he literally went through all of England and found out what everybody owned so he could tax them on it. And I'm sure it sucked at the time, to have this foreign usurper coming in and taxing you. I'm sure Americans have no idea what that's like today. But the one upside for posterity's sake is we have an extensive amount of knowledge about the English people and their culture back in the day, because back at that time period, because they record so much. So for example, we know that there was a very thriving beer breweries. There were a lot of breweries back then. A lot of beer making was going on. And that was the other thing that I think that demonstrates that the Normans didn't really conquer England culturally, is because the English drank beer, the French drank wine. The English wine was considered like a punishment. You would give it to someone if you hated them. Whereas that was kind of the running joke, is like, you give it like you drink English wine with your nose closed, and you gag on it. Whereas the French wine was really good. So the French drank wine and the English drank beer, but that didn't really change. And that's probably just the climate. Like, you're not going to grow good. You're not going to have good vineyards in England.
You don't have. Yeah, I don't. To this day, no one's going out and saying, "Oh yeah, this is a great English wine."
Well, I gotta say, when I was in England, I was drinking some of their beer, and what I thought was really quirky was that they don't have their beer pressurized. It's all pumped like the old-fashioned way. So it's very.
Yeah, that was sorry to interrupt, but I remember when I was in England, a buddy of mine who I met him when he was in the U.S. He was born and raised in London, and then anyway, he went back. And then when I went over to visit, he wanted to show me, the English beers, and they call them bitters, or some of them they do. I forget exactly what it means, but they literally, it's like the bartender almost like he's pumping it out, like almost like the way you do a well. The way that you want to just talk about that briefly, what the hell that is.
Well, it's like our beer, American beer, is pressurized. So when they're serving it, all they have to do is just pull the tap, or crank the hand. They don't have to crank the handle. They just have to pull it, and the pressure within the keg releases the beer into your glass. Whereas most English beers are flat. They don't have that. That was the thing about Boddington's. That was a beer that I've enjoyed. Boddington's was one of those beers that naturally got like creamy, had that kind of creamy top to it. And
Stout.
yeah, the stouts where they had that. So if you buy the Boddington ales in a can, they have that little pressurized thing. The same with Guinness, where you open the bottle and they've got the little pressurized thing that causes lot of air bubbles or pockets to like form. But that was the thing about the English, culturally. I think that had the invasion not succeeded, one, Harold Godwin would probably be much more well known. I think that would have been kind of on par with Elizabeth I in the Great Armada, where the Great Armada, they were going to invade England and that failed. I think that it would have become much more of a culturally defining part of English history. Now, on the other hand, the Magna Carta would have never happened because John was a Norman king.
Well, actually, could you expound on that, on the Magna Carta?
So King John was he as the historian noted for this book, he said he is the only king. Like there's no other King John. No king of England will ever be named John. He was that bad. And he wasn't like the worst in terms of like his cruelty or his ruthlessness. He was not only vicious and brutal, but he was incompetent to boot. And so he did a lot of things that you don't do. For example, he levied lots of taxes on the nobility, and then he tried to seduce their wives. So that's probably not a good combination. That's not a good combination.
Right. You can do one or the other. Not, yeah.
Right. And he ended up.
You're charged my wife. It's like, yeah, all
right. That and he lost all these. He fought these conflicts with France and lost them all. So he lost a huge chunk. Like he basically is John is responsible for the kind of combination of like the Norman identity with England for the Normans within, because he lost all control of Normandy to the French. And when he did that, a lot of the Norman barons and noblemen in England had to decide, because they owned estates in Normandy as well. They had to choose where they were going to live and to which king they were going to swear fealty to. And
what time period was this?
This was it's like the 1200s.
Well, yeah, because there was because the English had because Edward the Longshanks. When was he? Like around 1300?
Yeah, 1300.
He controlled a large part. Well, he controlled Normandy, right? A huge part of France. It's like Joan of Arc kind of stuff, and all that was going on there. So England had a long-standing. I guess it goes back to William the Conqueror. Had this long-standing presence in France.
Right. And what happened is when John lost control of Normandy for that time period, the noblemen had to choose where they were going to swear fealty, because if you didn't swear fealty to the king of that ruling that area, they would just confiscate your lands and estates. So a lot of them decided to remain in England, and it was kind of difficult for some of them because Normandy was their homeland, but all their estates are in England, or most of them, and they're not going to give it up. So they ended up, that's where a lot of the I don't want to say modern, but just the English identity changed very permanently in a way that wouldn't have happened if the Anglo-Saxons had prevailed at the Battle of Hastings. They would have, theoretically, you could have seen where Anglo-Saxon nobility remained throughout English history. They may have become much more cloistered, if that's a proper word for it. They may not have been as much of explorers, and this is getting a little bit into the speculative territory, but they may have become more like Iceland. I mean, Iceland is very their people are descendants from the Scandinavians who went there, but they've really been, I don't want to say obscure, but they're just, for lack of a better word, just historically irrelevant, other than the monks who recorded a lot of Icelandic sagas and tales, but they haven't played a dominant role in world history. Whereas England's, now obviously their population is much smaller. They're like only 600,000 people or something like that. Like I believe
they're less than that, actually.
I remember like half the nation's population showed up to the airport when their rugby team won some sort of competition. I was like, half the nation, like when half your nation can show up to an airport, it's like, it's kind of cool. Like
Well, they
your
only have
nation's
one
nothing.
So it's
Right, right. And also they don't have any, they've had no type of what do you call it? Ethnic there in Iceland. There are only blue-eyed people in Iceland. There's their genetic and ethnic heritage is very narrow. Like there's not a lot of
that is
the kind of
just simple geography, distance of
right.
where they're located, and it was the Vikings of I can't remember who I was having this conversation with about the Vikings, because up until like I guess within the last 20, 30 years, people didn't realize just how far the Vikings traveled. Like,
Yeah.
these guys like went to like, they were in like Iran and Iraq and stuff like that. I mean, they went from like Denmark and Norway to like, I mean, they went everywhere. And I'm thinking, man,
Right.
stuff must have been really rough where you lived that you were willing to travel like that. It's like,
Well, that I think that was part of the Viking culture, was they were explorers. Like that was the idea of going out and to venturing to different places. I mean, yeah, the fact that they were able to go all the way to Canada. I mean, Leif Erikson was ostensibly the first European to set foot in America. Now people can argue about that, and I was like, I just know he was there before Christopher Columbus. Like I
don't think anyone's really disputing that, but he never I mean, the Vikings did have a failed colony in Greenland. That's not disputed.
Right.
I believe there's still ruins there that have been preserved. And the Vikings, they did come to the quote unquote North America. But that was just kind of their way. But generally speaking, the Vikings would just be like raiders. Like they weren't necessarily settlers. At some point, they did start to settle, maybe just because their numbers got so great, or maybe it was easier to settle than it was to keep raiding. Maybe they could make more. Like I know, for example, Dublin, Ireland, like that was named the island. The island was named by the Vikings. They named it Erie Land, Ireland, and
right.
They was basically a trading port for trade established by the Vikings. And I think I could be wrong, but I think York was the first time the Vikings actually established like a self-sufficient Viking colony outside of Scandinavia.
I think that I just don't see anything in their culture at that time that would indicate that they would be interested in exploration. That really started to change with. I'll say it again.
No, you roboted a little bit there. You didn't see anything. They
just weren't terribly. They were not explored, for lack of. I'm trying to think of the correct word, but they were not explorers at the time of. William the Conqueror. I think that they were kind of settling in. They were still going through a period of conquest. Nations that are going through conquest or that kind of stuff aren't going to go explore other areas. They're going to be more interested in trying to build stability in their own place. And the age of exploration really kicked off with Christopher Columbus's discovery of the arriving at the New World. But I mean, Portugal, the Dutch. The Spanish. I mean, you saw a lot of explorers from other areas going there. So it would have been curious to see if England had just become very insular, almost like Japan. Japan's a great case study where they just sealed their borders and became a very insular, isolated nation that didn't have any contact with the outside world. And then, within a few decades, they then had modern technology or something like that, and yet they're still preserving their tradition.
I can't remember the name of the title of the film. I don't know, maybe someone in the chat might know the name of it. I think it was Martin Scorsese's film. It might be called Silence. about the Jesuit monk that was sent to Japan, and then he ended up kind of. The Japanese saw Christianity as a threat to social cohesion, and they viciously fought against it. And it was a film. I know Scorsese directed it. I don't know who wrote it, and I'm trying to remember who starred in it. And it's not people like you and I would enjoy it, or do enjoy it, because it's, you know, the historical context of it. But the average person might not really get that much out of it. But it showed how the Japanese viewed Christianity as something that they couldn't allow, because it would prevent. They saw it as they understood how religion and culture are necessary to maintain a nation state. If that makes any sense.
Well, I think that what happens is it depends. Like with the Romans, their religion really wasn't tied to their morality either. I was reading about the Romans, and their classical virtues and their code of honor was actually separate from religion, which is really for people from a Christian background is really fascinating, because like religion for them is the root cause, like the root. That's where your morality stems from. Whereas with the Romans, that wasn't the case. But I think that the fact that it's from a foreign area, it's not native. It always becomes an issue. I mean, when the Anglo-Saxons who invaded England, we used to be pagan, and then they converted to Christianity, and then it became, their identity from that time period on, moving onward. The same with a lot of these other. This is what I think people always find or kind of miss, is like a lot of areas that later became very Christianized were not always the case, and a lot of areas today that are Muslim used to be very Christian. But they got conquered by the Muslims or subjugated or just something. I mean, and then of course there's America, which I would describe as like a very confused polytheistic religious society, if that's the best way to describe it. But it's I think it's more just when you introduce a foreign religious belief, like that's not from it's like if you bring foreign philosophy into an area where now you're competing tradition versus novelty or innovation or something that's just from somewhere else. And particularly with religion, if you're saying you're speaking the truth, then that says that like your traditions are not part of the truth, right? I mean, it's different for, say, someone who's descends from Christians to be part of the church, as opposed to someone who has to essentially renounce the faith of their ancestors or their forefathers or something like that. So, I mean, that gets into the psychology, but it would have been that would have changed things perhaps with the Anglo-Saxons if they'd still been pagan, or if the Normans had been pagan. I mean, it would have it might have completely altered that kind of stuff. But I think that
the interesting thing about Christianity is that it spread very quickly, and it was very malleable, for lack of a better word. So many pagan traditions were just incorporated into Christianity. That made it a lot more. How do I say it? Appetizing to people. Like they were saying, "Oh, it's no big deal," like it's okay. We don't have the winter solstice, but you just made Christmas at the same time, like that kind of thing.
Yeah, I don't know the extent. I see conflicting arguments both ways, and to me, it's sort of a. I mean, I can definitely see. I don't want to say pagan, but I can definitely see similar. The thing is with like Western Christianity, like the Catholic Church is definitively Western in its practices, its aesthetics, and other stuff. I mean, but then you look at the Eastern Orthodox Church, and it's culturally very Eastern. It's Eastern tends to be much more mystic. And I'm not saying that there's no mysticism in Catholicism, but I think that that's why Protestantism has always always been an issue in the East, because it's so I'm not saying Protestants are logical, like that. That's their thing. But like, I'm not saying they're the most logical people. I'm saying like logic or rational or reasoning or argument. Like you with Protestantism, it's based on argument and debate. Like that's how you come to the truth, which is much more philosophical. Whereas Catholicism and the Eastern Orthodox Church see it more religion more as an experience rather than a debate. And so that allows for a lot more of the unknown, the mystery, and the mysticism. That's why, like, if you go to I've never been to a Catholic mass, traditional Catholic mass, but it's probably much more mystical in terms of what's going on than in a Protestant church where it kind of feels like you're at a rock and roll concert or something like that.
Yeah, I always say the Protestants have the best music and light show.
Yeah, their music now is like the butt of jokes, but that's a kind of a separate thing. With the Anglo-Saxons, and with England, the other thing is that England doesn't have a lot of great natural resources. It does have with some. It's got certain types of mining. It's always had good farming for like sheep and cattle and stuff like that. But a lot of other natural resources. This is partly why England had to go explore, is because they had to get those natural resources elsewhere. They weren't going to get it within their own island if they wanted to keep up with other nations around them. But they also, I'd say, the fact that they're an island allowed them to carve out already a separate identity from, say, France and Germany, because France and Germany, physically are next to each other. England's history has been defined by the fact that it's an island, and if you want to invade it, you have to cross a body of water to get through it. And yeah, Normandy was
also forced them to always have a competent navy, because that was the only way to maintain trade. So they always would have it. That would be something that whoever was in charge of the island understood. We have to have that well financed. Where countries like,
I think. Well, the other thing that I think that would later shape England's history, and I'm not sure how this would have come about, later on, but during the Reformation, when England decided to break away from the Catholic Church, there was attempts to invade England. And I think that that's what really gave them sort of this, like, we've got to compete with Spain and France and all these other other rival nations. So it was a bit. I just wonder if they had been kind of seen just as that remote, if they had maintained that identity as being kind of a remote area of Europe, where like the backwater. I'm not saying like this isn't to denigrate. Like I really admire Anglo-Saxon culture. I think that they may have probably they probably would have had a better form of government, because if people look at the Anglo-Saxon structure of government, it was I think very admirable, particularly compared to what we have now on that. But like their king was not like this dictator type guy that we would see them as today. He had to rely on his on the people below him. Like they had this, I think it was the Woden or the Thing. They called it a Thing. It was where it was his counselor or something like that. But his leadership, his legitimacy wasn't like, there was no divine right of kings that would have completely thrown them off in terms of like beliefs on government. Like, no, the king is not ordained by God. We don't, that would have been a completely foreign concept to them. I just don't know if the invasion of with the Normans would have changed that if it had failed.
Yeah, it's kind of really hard to know what would have happened. But one of the things that is interesting when you're looking at a battle of that time period, this was 1066, right? The Battle of Hastings.
Yeah, 1066. So for people who are just as a context, this is 30 years before the Pope Urban II calls for the First Crusade. Okay.
So yeah, well, that's actually quite fascinating, because Europe, how do I say this? The Pope was calling for a crusade when Europe was still struggling with its own identity. And
you had so much. Yeah, you had so much fighting. This is kind of the double, not double, but the dichotomy of Christendom. Like Europe had been, even when it was fully Christianized, it was Christianized in name, but if you look at what the people were actually doing, one could hardly like. I read about some of the stuff, and granted, this is a different time period. This is back when if you weren't a ruthless SOB as a ruler, you'd get your head chopped off and your whole family would die, because the other guy across from you is going to be more brutal than that. And there's a lot of cases I was reading about where when a person won a war and showed leniency, it was seen as weakness. Like this was a time when you could not, like being weak was considered a vice. You had to be strong. So as brutal as some of these guys were, I'm not necessarily judging them or saying how could they possibly be like that. It's like, hello, it's like growing up in in a bad part of an urban ghetto. Like that's not an area where you get to like talk about pacifism as if you're living in
my childhood there, TJ. So
no, right. You gotta fight to survive.
Oh.
And
no, that was it was funny. Like I was had this conversation many times, maybe even with you. Was one of the interesting things between my generation and what I'm seeing, like the Zoomers, some of the millennials, was the idea where people embrace being a victim, which is that concept is so foreign to me, because if you saw yourself or displayed victimhood, that was just like telling everybody to beat the shit out of me and steal my lunch money. You know what I mean? Like that was one of the things I could never get my head around. Still can't. I mean, I still, I understand because it's incentivized, but psychologically, I just can't understand that. You know what I mean? Like kind of like what you were just saying, like, on a mic.
Right. Yeah, that's exactly the point, is that I don't understand. It's kind of like what General Patton said during his famous speech. When you were a kid, you all admired the big league baseball champion, the best boxer, fastest runner, the marble winner. He goes, Americans love a winner and don't tolerate a loser. And we've gone from that to where being a loser is a sign of social status, and actually being a victim, having bad things happen to you. But this isn't a society where there's no consequences for being weak, but also because you have someone else who can do violence for you. Back in the medieval period, if you were a weak king, you would either be destroyed by your enemies or your own people would remove you for their own survival, and or they would turn against you. Like that was not a sustainable way of doing things. And it would also just draw such disgust. This is why I think there's so much psychological dysfunction with people today, is because what we tolerate would not have been tolerable to these people. They would have preferred death to what as a collective group of millions of people, what we tolerate having done to us. People would have preferred death in prior eras, because I think they understood on some level what it does to your soul, for lack of a better word, is it just degrades you to where death is preferable. So yeah, I've never really understood.
But you know what I'm talking about, right? When I said I can't get this. Like people say, oh, you're just an old fogey, you don't understand. It's like, no, I don't. I really don't get this. It's like, how do you get points by telling people you're weak? I just
because it's a society. Today's society is based around the feminine or female concept of like not pity, but just you're supposed to take compassion on the weak. And
I'm not saying the problem with taking compassion on them, but I'm sorry, go ahead.
I don't think that this is like I think the women back in those days would have despised what's going on now, but I think that's because they were raised with a traditional, healthy understanding of the world. Like, I was reading, we're kind of going off tangent with the whole Anglo-Saxon, but yeah. Basically, the Anglo-Saxons would have probably drank a lot of beer, not been interested in exploration, and probably had some sort of limited form of government that I think their architecture that was one. I will throw this out before I go on to that other issue. Most Anglo-Saxon architecture was destroyed at some point. So the Normans replaced it with their own. There wouldn't have been as many Norman. There wouldn't have been
Was it because they saw it like as offensive, or they just saw it as a superior, or was it?
Well, as we're seeing now, when you invade a country, you tear down the buildings that were or statues that were there before it, right? I mean, that's a that's a sign of conquest. So, I think it was also they were tearing stuff down and putting up their own because they probably thought it was better. I mean, Norman keeps were very Anglo-Saxons built Motte and Baileys for the most part. I do want to clarify, not all Anglo-Saxon architecture, but just a lot of it. I mean, Westminster Abbey or Cathedral was built during Edward the Confessor. He had it built. So that like there is that stuff, but a lot of the infrastructure that was there as a result of the Normans would not have been there. They
left the Roman architecture, like the baths and all that, you know.
Yeah, that had been preserved, and yeah, that's another interesting thing is that the Britons really did not retain any of their like the Roman culture when the Romans left. They just went back to doing what they had been doing before. So Roman culture really didn't stick with the Britons at that time. And like I was saying,
reasons for that. One is that for the most part, the Romans bought off the Celtic tribes and let them somewhat self-govern. They had garrisons there. The garrisons were made up of quote unquote indigenous auxiliary, you know, once they reached the point of pacification. So, you know, and that's why, like, for example, like linguistically, there's not as much of a footprint there as well as genetically.
I think that's yeah. So going back to what was gosh, we were talking about like losers and getting beat up and all that kind of stuff.
Just sum it up, because I don't want to talk to it. These guys give me a headache. But say your piece on that.
I think that women back in the day understood that their men had to be strong or they weren't going to survive. They were going to get conquered. So they despised weakness in men, they do now, but they didn't pretend otherwise. I think that's the problem with today's society is they talk about how they want really nice guys who are not a threat. They don't want dangerous men because they want men that they can control. That was not a luxury that women could afford at a time when their husbands needed to be, cold-blooded killing machines if need be in a war. Like you kind of like with the Spartan women, where they said, you know, come back on with your shield or on it. Like, I'm not going to tolerate a coward for a husband.
Yeah, I was thinking about that quote when you were saying that. Like, that was that famous quote in you've probably seen it from the movie, but it was true. The Spartan women viewed that of their men. And do you want to explain what that means? Like, everybody knows come back with your shield part, man. But do you know what I'm sure you do, but do you want to explain it for others what it means, what come back with your shield or on it means? I will.
So the Spartans had very, very big shields that they used as part of their phalanx. That was like, you know, with the Saxons, they used it as a shield wall. But it was big enough where you could put a wounded soldier on it and drag him away from a battle. So the term "with your shield or on it" implied you returned in victory, or you returned with you were wounded. But if you came back without it, it meant you threw it down so that you could run away from a battle. Yeah. If you came back with your shield, chances were you didn't lose and you didn't run away.
Yeah. So the whole idea was, the whole idea was come back with your shield or on it was that if you came back without your shield was mean you broke ranks, I guess would be what it was. To the Spartans was the ultimate sin, I guess, to the point of, because the whole idea was, the interesting thing about the Spartans, do you know what they called each other? They didn't call each other Spartans. You know what they called each other?
Oh, no, I don't know.
Equals.
Interesting.
Yeah. The whole idea, they called each other equals. Because I did
not know that.
Everything there was this uniformity. Another interesting thing about Spartan culture is when you died, they did bury their dead in Sparta, but the only two types of people that were allowed to have headstones with their names on it, or only two instances where this was allowed, was one was women who died during childbirth, and the other was men who died during battle.
Huh. Interesting.
Yeah, that's how they, because that was the service of the state. That's how they viewed it. But the state to a Spartan was a little bit different because everybody had skin in the game. It wasn't like, it's kind of like what you were talking about. It's like back in the day, the kings rode into battle. Like they weren't, today you have generals in the Pentagon directing drone strikes. It wasn't like that back then. Like Leonidas, for example, you had everybody knows the story of the 300. The king fought right alongside his men,
Right. That's another thing that is hard to process today. The idea that of our political leaders fighting in a war, because most of them probably couldn't.
Fighting.
Well, I mean, but also think about that in terms of you talk about age. William Marshall, who was the famous Norman knight and champion of the Magna Carta, he at one point he was like in his late 60s, mid 60s, and there was some sort of dispute with the king at the time, and he offered to do a trial by combat. That's where the idea was that the whoever might makes right. Like if you win if you win this fight, God's decided that you're on the side of right.
Gods wouldn't allow someone who was this. Yeah. It's kind of an Arthurian concept, but anyway, continue.
Yeah, and so the king would select someone if they were willing to take up the offer. And William Marshall is in his mid 60s, and not one of the young knights would challenge him. And this dude's in his mid 60s at the time. So I think that they were not only like, even if they were older back then, they still fought in campaigns. I mean, William Marshall had fought in many battles. He'd been a champion of the tournament circuit. Whereas our politicians today they're weak in every meaningful way. But it goes back to what I was saying about Seattle. They're weak, but they're reflective of the values of the people around them who elect them, which is they value weakness. They see if it was only a handful of people who are weak, but their strength is in their numbers. They're like their ability, like the mob is a great way for weak people to have strength, because you can have one strong guy, but if you have 20 weak people who have it out for him, who are cowards, he's gonna have a hard time unless he's got a gun and he can shoot fast.
Yeah, I don't care how strong and tough you are, and I've known some really strong, tough guys. But if there's 10 people against you, you're going down.
Yeah,
that's just,
Yeah, that's pretty much it.
But anyway, so if it's okay with you, if you still have a little bit of time, can we talk about the battles of Col King Gol?
Yeah, I put my book down and you have the 4.
Okay. All right. Well, just to set this up, okay, the reason these battles were not quote unquote major, and by major I mean in the sizes of the numbers of forces as far as manpower, tanks, and planes. The reason I find I would say battles, because it wasn't like there was one battle. It took place over about 6 to 8 weeks of minor skirmishes and 2 semi-major, and major with an asterisk, because battles, and they took place in 1939. And the reason these battles are interesting from a historical context is because it totally changed Japanese, how do I say this? I almost said the phrase war policy. But the Japanese were expanding north. Okay, this happened in Manchuria. It was kind of like the border with the Soviet Union and Manchuria, and the Japanese had been expanding out since I don't know 1931, TJ, around that. Like the Japanese had started, and they or even maybe I think 29 is when they first. But anyway, so they kind of had been just going out just unchecked, and there was some you know, you got to look at the time period this was happening in. It was the 1930s, and especially in that part of, you know, Asia, like borders were kind of very loosely defined, and a lot of times borders were defined somewhat arbitrarily and kind of based on maybe geography. Like if there was a river or a mountain range or something, that was kind of a de facto boundary, but it wasn't necessarily codified in international law per se. So what happened was, what made these battles interesting was the Japanese were defeated, and they were defeated decisively. Now, even though the Soviet Union at the time suffered a higher percentage of losses, it was much easier for them to replenish them because, of course, you know, they were fighting on their home ground, as we were talking about earlier, and why that's, you know, home field advantage is a real thing, especially in war.
Right.
And so the Japanese, the reason is, so the Japanese were defeated in these series of battles. And you can Google this. It's called the Battles of Kholkhin Gol. But what's interesting is not so much the battles or the order of battle that had happened, but the implications of it for the future. So because the Japanese were defeated, they totally changed. They actually reversed direction. Instead of continuing to go north into Siberia and further into northern Manchuria, they actually turned south. And how do I say this? If the Japanese had been victorious at these battles, or even not necessarily victorious, but even if they had fought to a stalemate, when Hitler decided to invade the Soviet Union in June of 1941, the Japanese could have taken advantage of that and invaded Siberia, which would have been a two-front war, which would have been a disaster for Stalin, which he could not have won. But because they were defeated at the battles of Kholkhin Gol, and by the way, if anyone's wondering, that's spelled KHALKHINGOL. That the Soviet Union was able to take all the troops that they had on the border of the Japanese expansion into China and send them to the defense of Moscow. But also the general that was assigned, the general that was took over the battle. Initially, there was another Russian general that was assigned there, but the one that was responsible for the Soviet Union's success was General Zhukov, who anyone that's a World War II armchair historian like us has heard about. That's where he kind of cut his teeth.
Right.
And was his first, significant victories. And then, you know, he was charged with the defense of Leningrad. Then he was just charged with the defense of Moscow. And, you know, he was actually one of the few guys that actually, we don't know how true this is, but apparently he was one of the few guys that had the balls to tell Stalin to go fuck himself to an extent, you know. But that's why these battles are very interesting. Not because the battles themselves, but the implications that they had, which is one of the reasons why when I first approached a couple months ago, when we first started talking about the idea of having these streams, was I wanted to talk about just not battles that were in and of themselves so important, but what would have happened if they went the other way? Like there might be this minor skirmish, whatever, but if they went the other way, how history could have taken a total left turn. And this is one of those battles, because think about this. What would have happened if the Soviet Union was presented with a two-front war during Operation Barbarossa?
Right. It would have, well, I mean, because the Germans got within sight of the Kremlin. They got very close.
Yeah, they got within. Well, yeah, they had recon units that were, according to legend, they were within. You know, they could see the Kremlin. Yeah,
right.
Yeah. I think maybe 20 miles of Moscow. But it's not even that. It was what the counteroffensive was led by the Siberian troops. That's what caught Army Group Center off guard. Was all the German intelligence, which was extremely flawed, said that the Soviet Union was on their last legs. They had exhausted all their reserves. They had nothing left. We're in the suburbs of Moscow. We can just kind of march in. And then all of a sudden, these Siberian troops storm them, and I think they pushed the Germans back like 10 miles within a few days. But those troops would have been tied up in the east, and basically Germany just walked into Moscow, and what would have happened then? Who knows?
Yeah, I mean, yeah, that would have been. I think that it would. I'm trying to think of. It probably would have resulted. I don't think it would have resulted in a German outright victory overall in the World War. I think it would have resulted in some sort of a truce or armistice or something like that. For all of what Winston Churchill was talking about, nothing but total victory or something like that. If the Russians had been knocked out, what
would have happened? Hitler would have been able to surrender, but surrender on his own terms.
They would have the Third Reich would have lasted past World War II. I think that the issue, of course, with pretty much any leader where you have a strong like with Franco, like with Cromwell, like with any great leader who is there's no replacement for him. So when he dies, what follows to form the stability, especially when you have a regime that's focused around one person. I don't know if it would have really lasted, because Franco ruled Spain for decades, and when he died, the effects kind of fell away pretty quickly. So I'm wondering if it's possible Russia wouldn't have been destroyed as much. Germany wouldn't have been destroyed as much. The politics of the post World War II would be totally different. I've been tempted to write a novel that looks at the modern day, like 1990 to 2000s, but where there was no World War II, and the Cold War is actually between Germany and the Soviet Union, and not America.
Yeah, that's what this stream is all about for me, is these what ifs, like what would have happened. Like, for example, let's say if the Japanese had won the battles of Kholkhin Gol, well, then the Soviet Union would have collapsed. So that made Germany, the Soviet Union would have collapsed. So there would have been no Cold War. So whether or not Germany would have, or I wouldn't say Germany, I would say like the Nazi, the Third Reich, whether that would have endured, that's almost an irrelevant question. There certainly would not have been a Cold War between the United States and the Soviet Union, because there wouldn't really be a Soviet Union, at least in the sense of that we came to know it, if that makes any sense.
Yeah, I think that if Russia had been conquered, it would have been, I don't think the Germans would have been able to hold on to it indefinitely, because the sheer amount of people.
They wouldn't have tried to. They would have just wanted the natural resources out of it, like the oil, like, for example.
Right.
So what was that area there by Turkey? But I can't remember the name of it. The oil fields there.
Yeah.
If they had the oil fields, then Germany could have been basically to the point where the United States might have been like, look, I think it might have been more like, okay, it probably would have ended up like, let's just go back to the original borders. Like, you can keep, greater Germania, but everything else you got to give back. And I think just because you almost have to think about it this way, like the United States and England and stuff like that, for the most part, they were democracies. So the will of the people, if their heart wasn't in it, you weren't going to have a war.
Yeah, I think that's the case. I think that also with the Soviet, the USSR was not Russia. It was a confederation of these different states. So that probably would have been split up. And, you know, knowing Germany, they probably would have had a little revenge on them by saying, oh, you got to split up your country. And Belarus would, you know, they probably would have taken it. Oh, another thing is Poland.
Ukraine would have asserted their independence. I mean, there's no way that if the Soviet Union was in that weakened state, they could have held on to Ukraine. Ukrainians hated the Russians.
Well, that, and also I think that the oh, here comes the train. I think that a lot of Prussia, like areas that are part of Poland now, would have, like Germany would have retained its original post or pre World War I state in that regard. But yeah, Belarus would have been its own, and it would have been in the Germans' interests to see decentralization within it. It's kind of funny about that is like they would argue for decentralization of power, not because, you know, they want independence within these nations, but because that means that Russia, the USSR, would not be able to present a threat to them ever again. The Russians would have been too weak, and they wouldn't have. These countries would also have provided a buffer for Germany, you know, to avoid an attack from Russia from then on. Like you'd have to go through all these different countries. Would obviously, if they were invaded, they would side with they would be sympathetic to the Germans coming in and resisting any kind of movement by the Russians. So that would have been a very. I just think. Oh, I wonder what America's culture would have been like from that period on, because, you know, World War II left America as the like dominant manufacturing economy in the world. Everybody else was recovering. America was one of like the only country in World War II that was a major player that didn't have a whole lot of there was no the home front was totally safe. We weren't like London that lost, you know, how much of it, and then, you know, the France got decimated, and you know, not to mention Germany and Russia. They, you know, had a good chunk of their cities were just like Leningrad was obliterated, and so was Dresden and all these other cities.
Yeah, the industrial capacity of these nations was completely destroyed. That's why and also like 1944, the idea of the U.S. dollar being the what do you call the world currency? What's the expression? Right. That wouldn't have happened, right? Like let's say the Soviet Union was, you know, knocked out of the war, or, you know, rendered impotent. Well, the United States. Where would that have left them? I mean, I think probably what would have happened would be that the United States probably would have been forced to, how do I say this? That would have focused way more of their energies in Southeast Asia, because you know, where it was, and I think Hitler was not in a rush to make any more enemies than he had to. If he knocked the Soviet Union out of the war, because, you know, Hitler didn't really want to like take over Western Europe. Like that wasn't his thing. He was kind of like forced into that once he invaded Poland.
Yeah, I was reading about. Oh, and you mentioned it. The war. Now the thing is that may not have ended the war between America and Japan. That might have still gone on. Like the Germans might have made peace with the British and the French. And they would have pulled out of France after, you know, signing some sort of a peace deal. But that would have been interesting, is if World War II was really confined to at some point to America, because then America could have devoted all of its resources to Japan. You know, people, I see some, and I think they got a legitimate point, but they're talking about how Russia absorbed a lot of the casualties from the war, but they were also fighting a one-front war. Whereas America was having to fight a two-front war against enemies that were where they had to send troops thousands of miles away, whereas their enemies could send supplies to the front within days from their industrial centers. So having America being able to devote both the Army and the Marine Corps and all their Air Force and all their resources, very likely that war would have ended much sooner with the Japanese. And the Japanese could have then pulled out of China. At that point, just said we're not going to be able to hold on to this giant for much longer. It's all kind of speculation, but I mean, even at the end of the war, Japan was holding on to parts of China when
Yeah, I
they
was
were,
going to say they may have had more troops in China than they did on the mainland at that point because they were had been bombed into submission by the Americans. Yeah.
but even then, the Japanese still held on to parts of China, and that's when they were ready to, sharpen bamboo sticks to ward off the American invaders in Japan. I mean, I'm not arguing in favor of the use of the atomic bombs, but this idea that the Japanese were not getting it, where there was no way they were going to win this war, and they're still like, oh, we're going to resist to the end. This is where it's like you're dealing with you're dealing with some delusional people here. It's kind of like the Black Knight from Monty Python, right? Where his limbs are all chopped off,
scratched.
yeah. He's like, oh, okay, we'll call it a draw.
Something
like that.
To that, but I think one of the reasons that, obviously one of the reasons, but of course the atomic bombs dropping, yes, but also a lot of people might not know this. I'm sure you do, but the Soviet Union declared war on Japan at the,
Oh yeah, that's right.
So they still own several Japanese islands to this day. So I think a lot of them were like, well, we surrendered to the Americans, we will all be speaking Russian soon. So I think factored into their reason for surrendering.
Right. I mean, it was like the German, not German high command people, but a lot of the Germans were like scrambling to get captured by the Americans before they didn't want to get captured by the Russians.
There was a really good documentary I saw on that where the Russian the German military. This was in May of 1945, after Hitler was already dead, and they were trying to make their way towards the U.S. lines to escape from the Russians, and the Americans were. American forces were in this conundrum where the German general said, we want to surrender. And the Americans were like, we got more POWs than we can handle, dude. There was that famous shot.
There was that famous shot from the Band of Brothers series, but also I have a photo of it in a World War II photo book of we're talking 500,000 Germans marching along along the Autobahn. Surrendering, and it's like if they wanted to fight, they could have overwhelmed the Americans there. There just weren't enough. There's too many people, but
the sheer numbers,
right. But I think they had no weapons, or they were out of ammunition, or they just were like, we're done dealing with this stuff. But that would have been a very fast. I think the 20th century would have been. The politics of Germany, I don't think that. I mean, this is all speculation. Who knows? But I don't think Germany would have remained.
The whole point is to speculate. That's
Yeah, I don't think Germany's politics would have remained the way it was in the 40s and the 30s. I think they would have probably, with the death of Hitler, who knows what he would have died from. But the politics would have just changed because he was such an integral part of that party, and I don't see any of the people replace anybody carrying on that. It was kind of it was like with Cromwell. I mean, Cromwell.
Yeah, I think you're referring to the expression, the cult of personality, where if this one guy goes, well, then what's holding it together? Now, I don't know if that's true because with Germany, at least, Hitler had this obsession of one of the reasons the war started was Hitler had this obsession of uniting all the German people, no matter where, no matter what country they were in, to be under, this greater Germania thing. That was the whole thing about Danzig and why he was obsessed, why East Prussia was separated from mainland Germany, why he, the Sudetenland, and why he, it started with Austria, uniting Austria, which that was his thing. So they did have to, at least more so than any other country, certainly more than the United States, they did have they were more homogeneous, linguistically, culturally than any other nation state. So that could have prevailed. I don't know.
I think politically as a country, the German country would have remained. I think that the political makeup, I just honestly don't know, because Germany was such a young country at the time. I mean, Otto von Bismarck was the one who really united all the different parts of Germany into a single country, because Germany's there's
Hold on,
nations and then there's
TJ. Safety Doc's asking me to blue. Hey, Dave, I don't know. I'm doing this within Streamlabs, so I don't know how to do that. TJ might be able to tell me how do I wrench somebody in.
I'm honestly not sure what that means. I must be. I need to keep up on my terminology. Apparently,
in the chat, like he wants me to give him the wrench, but I don't know how to.
Maybe he means throw him a bone.
No. No. Anyway, I'm sorry. Go ahead, TJ.
I think that what would have happened is the politically the country would have remained whole, and it probably would have turned into some sort of a. What it probably would have been is a leader who was more, I don't want to say moderate, but it wouldn't have been focused on the person. There would have been the cult of the nation, kind of like with like Manifest Destiny wasn't driven by an individual president. It was driven by a national thing. So they'd say, Germany has its own Manifest Destiny where it's going to become the dominant, ruling country. But I think the question is, of course, who would their rivals have been at that time? Because it probably, I don't see it being the United States, but England was already kind of being weakened at that time. And then you have France. If the Battle of France had already been over, it's possible the French could have recovered and like learned their mistakes, but they also weren't like huge enemies. Well, they also weren't huge enemies. It's like because I was looking at the terms of the armistice or the surrender that the Germans were offering before the Battle of England, and it was basically like promise not to invade us, and we'll withdraw from France and all this other stuff because we want to invade Russia. We want to attack Russia. Just don't attack us, and I always found that interesting. Churchill was the one who wanted to strangle Bolshevism in the cradle during their civil war. But then when you had an opportunity for someone to invade Russia and deal with that, you kind of turn it down. But that's just, I think, I have no idea what the politics of England were at the time and how they were looking at stuff. But that I always just found that dichotomy of where Churchill was such an anti-communist, 20 years before, and then he's engaged in this alliance with them. I don't know how he processed that or was able to do it. I wouldn't have done it. I just I don't, but the thing about Russia, to compare, Stalin died and you had this, I'm not going to say moderate, but Khrushchev was not a radical and he did the de-Stalinization. The thing is, I don't think there was much of a purge of the Nazi party that there was of Stalin killed or imprisoned 90% of the Communist Party prior to during his time. He really got rid of anybody who might be a threat. That didn't happen.
Well, he got rid
Germany.
I don't know about 90%. He did get rid of 80% of the officer corps once he assumed power of the army.
Right. That's why. Yeah, that's why the army was so weak. There was actually an anecdote I was reading about in a history book where the Russian frontline troops were reporting that they were being bombed, and their commanders were nitpicking the fact that they were not using the right channel. They weren't taking it seriously. The Russian army was commanded by a bunch of mediocre political hacks, and that was classic communism. We don't care if you can win wars, we just want to make sure you're politically reliable. But then of course they start losing. There was that one battle where the Germans encircled 600,000 Russian soldiers, just to completely wiping out these armies.
Well, yeah, one of the challenges that in fairness to the Russian officers, because you look at these battles and yes, they were disastrous to the Russians, but a lot of it was because the way the Soviets did it was there was a political officer as well as a military officer. If that makes any sense? There was
the commissar.
Yeah. So so they weren't as incompetent as it seemed. It was more like they were like, well, if I do this, because the commissar won't agree with it, I'll be shot. And the commissar had no military. I'm sure he was a devout communist and knew all the rhetoric and could quote Karl Marx, but he had no military expertise. So that was the challenge. So if Stalin had allowed their, even as incompetent as, even though many of their best officers had been purged, even the ones that had remained, if they had been left to their own devices, would have done much better. I mean, the first 2 months of the war were just disastrous for the Soviet Union. My God.
Yeah, you know, it's also, I mean, this might be a different episode to do, is the Battle of France, because the first month of the World War I was almost we were even talking about this on one episode where I was talking about or maybe it was another podcast, but the Schiff von, I can never pronounce his name, but there was the German general who had that idea of invading by keeping the right strong and then, enveloping the French. World War I almost ended the same way World War II and, for the Battle of France ended. It could have easily been a 1-month war. What would have been interesting in World War II is if the French had actually managed to keep the Germans out. And would it have?
I don't think the thing in World War II, I don't think they could have.
I don't think they could have either, because they put everything.
The Belgians and I don't think it was possible. I think that don't get me wrong, the French fucked up. Excuse my French, but they screwed up. But I think it was more just because of the political realities that they just couldn't do certain things. Like the British troops were not allowed on soil of certain nations and things like that. And a lot of those, like the Netherlands, Denmark, and so they were trying to maintain this quasi neutrality. And so, yeah, don't get me wrong. The French could have, because I mean, you look at the Battle of France, it was almost like a joke, like to the Germans. They were like, I mean, I remember reading that the Germans lost more tanks that broke down than they did from combat.
I mean, the German, I mean, but it was also a surprise to the Germans how easily they won the Battle of France.
Yeah.
They were kind of just shocked. Like, is it really, I mean, after World War I, where they lost millions of men and couldn't take these fortresses like Verdun, for that to be lost. But going back to, I think that probably would have happened in Germany is there would have been probably not a pushback, but there would have been a shift toward more moderation in. There would have been a leader who, like Khrushchev, it's not about him. It's more of like you're looking for some sort of political stability where the cult is now about, Germania or like, you have some sort of personified, like with France, they have not Lady Liberty, but some female figure. And with us, we have Columbia to some extent. And that was much more popular, back when America was actually a nation and not an economic opportunity zone. So, I think that they would have created some sort of cult or god, like some sort of personification of Germany. And like, no matter who, because then you're not as much of a, not as much of a threat. What do I say? People are not going to try to replace you politically because they're not going to be able to replace what actually has the power, which is this concept.
Well, this mythos. The thing about like Hitler, like if let's say they had, we talked about like the possibilities of how they could have not necessarily won, but maintained it. There would be a certain mythos about Hitler that like, well, he united all the German people, so no one could ever really speak out about that because it would be so culturally taboo, for lack of a better phrase.
Yeah, it really would have depended on who took over afterwards. But unlike Stalin, the Germans, Stalin didn't really have a cult. He just killed people who didn't like him. Like Stalin, it kind of reminds. I assume you've seen the film Defiance. That film about one of my favorite scenes, and it's becoming much more pertinent now, is where the socialist, the secular Jewish guy is arguing with the rabbi, and he goes, "So you mean to tell me that all of politics is meaningless?" And the rabbi turns to him and says, In the West, a monster with a small mustache. In the East, a monster with a big mustache. This is all I need to know about politics. And then the socialist guy says, "Oh, your Messiah will have a mustache." And he goes, "No, the Messiahs are in politics and they are killing us."
Yeah,
that laugh line.
Well, no, actually,
Yeah,
that's an interesting movie because it showed the dichotomy within the Jewish population of Eastern Europe between the quote unquote farmers and the
Yeah.
that's Jews. It was under
Mel Busham.
Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, it wasn't the best. I'd say, like, the film could have had some improvements in terms of like just structure, but I thought it was very fat. I'd never.
Well, I also thought it was funny that they had like the guy that looked like a guy from an SS recruiting poster to be a Jew. You know, the guy, the James Bond guy. What's his name?
Oh yeah, Daniel Craig. Yeah,
Daniel Craig was playing the Jewish guy, and I'm like, this doesn't look like your Eastern European.
Yeah, because I actually was reading about that guy, and you look at the actual people, and like, yeah, they picked very Anglicized guys to play the main characters, at least. Whereas you look at the actual guys, it's like, yeah, those are not English.
Yeah, but fine. Whatever, Hollywood.
Yeah. It's exactly Hollywood. What do you expect? And so, going back to the whole issue of that, but also, if Japan had surrendered, because I think the underlying cultures in both Germany and Japan was fight to the end. At least at the time, like with under the Nazis, like it was, you got to fight to the end. And then in Japan, it was the same thing. I just wonder if it's kind of like that line from Red Dawn where they're asking, like, why did this war start? And Powers Booth's character says, two toughest kids on the block, sooner or later, they're going to fight.
Mm-hmm.
I wonder if the United States had become a dominant world power and Germany had been the dominant world power in Europe, if that would have forced confrontation. But at the same time, I don't. They didn't have anything that
addressed this exact point.
Oh, which one is that?
It's called Fatherland.
Is that by that Turtle Love, or what's his name?
I don't believe it's by Turtle Dove. I can't remember. Someone in the chat might know. It's called Fatherland. I've read it years and years. Actually, they made a TV, I think with like an HBO movie on it back, in the 90s. Who was the guy that was in Blade Runner? The
Harrison Ford.
No. The guy that could act. The replicant.
Oh, I know what you're talking about. Yeah.
Yeah, he played a policeman who it took place in 1964, and it's an alternative history novel, obviously, where Germany wins the war. Well, actually, I mean, they didn't win it like basically what the to set it up is, okay, so D-Day fails, the German offensive in the East stalemated. But Germany is the United States and Germany were kind of like the United States and North Korea, where there was never the war never ended, but there was like a ceasefire, for lack of a better word. And it takes place in 1964. And it's Germany is kind of coming apart. It's Hitler's 75th birthday, and the Germans are desperate to form a détente with the United States. Like they need this to happen economically, whatever.
Right.
And that's all I'll say about it. If people, you could read the novel or watch the film version of the novel. But it's called Fatherland. It's quite interesting.
Yeah, that's what what would have made that very fascinating is that America, obviously had its English and Protestant background in terms of its history. So they just wouldn't really. America really didn't have a lot of like enemies, kind of like rival. It didn't really have a rivalry. Like we made peace with England after the War of 1812. After that, we're like, you know what, we're not having any more wars with you. We're going to settle this stuff peacefully, and they ended up, establishing strong relations. So, I think that that's the nice thing, or not the nice necessarily the nice thing, but like up until a certain point, America really didn't have any people that or groups that it had this intense kind of hostility to. And yes, I understand that a lot of foreign policy people will point out America's meddling in other countries throughout the world, throughout parts of its history. But, besides Mexico, I think that it didn't really cement a lot of bad blood in a way where it's on both sides. I get that there's a lot of countries that don't like America, but are there a lot of countries where America really doesn't like them in return? Because that's what really matters.
No, that's true. But it's interesting you mentioned the War of 1812. I remember Matt Forney did a podcast or something on that where he said that up until we won the War of 1812, that the British kind of always thought they could retake the United States or at least subjugate it. And it wasn't until the War of 1812 that they kind of, at least it formalized within the British consciousness that the United States was a independent sovereign nation and would remain so.
Right. That was where they really realized, like, we're not going to be able to, it's going to be its own permanent country. And there was a lot of stuff that happened between the U.S. and England during that time that was not like, there was a reason for a lot of people did not like the English, or the British, or whatever you want to, term you ever want to use. But that eventually mended itself. Even though, I went to England. This is kind of the funny thing. I've been to England and I've been to France, and I found, maybe it was just the areas I went to, but I found the French to be, or at least the Normans. I really loved Normandy, and I thought the Norman people were really, I really enjoyed their interacting with them. I just found them to be the English, like, I kind of got this impression that they don't like Yanks.
Actually, unfortunately, I had that same experience, but it's really dangerous to use anecdotes. Like I did have I was riding the train back with the friend I mentioned earlier and his American wife, and when we got off the train and we were walking back, the people got off the same stop on the train, and they screamed out, "You effing Yank," at me, and I have no idea where that came from. I was like, "What?"
Yeah, as opposed to like, I've had relatives who, went to Italy, and there's parts of Italy that were liberated by the Allies, and if you're an American, you're like a celebrity there. They love you. They'll basically, like, I don't want to say wine and dine, but they'll basically, you're their best friend or something like that. Whereas in England, that wasn't the case. And I'm not saying like people were overly friendly, or like whatever it was in Normandy, but they seemed like they were more American. They felt like they were more relatable culturally
than the Parisians, shall we say.
I gotta say, I've said this before. I actually did a Terror House magazine story essay on this. I've never seen so many beautiful women than in Central Paris. I was sitting there having a drink with my buddy, and there was like, we're talking like in America.
We're talking why people sit outside the cafes is just to watch the girls go by.
Well,
the Hemingway cliche of sitting outside the cafe. It's like no. It wasn't like because I just want to check out the legs, man. Yeah.
Well, that's what the funny thing is that whatever the reputation the French have, their women were the women were all very, like, they had impeccable taste in their fashion, and they were also they dressed very modestly. Like, I didn't see any immodest dress in Central Paris, and these women were we're talking like at least a 9 minimal, and they were everywhere, and they were like the stereotypical, dressed like a French girl on a bicycle with a baguette in the basket or something like that. It was really weird, but I was like turning to my buddy and I like, we need to come here more often.
What's the rent here?
Yeah, exactly. What's the rent? Well, that's the thing that threw me off about these European cities. The wealth is in the central parts of the city, in the downtown urban areas. The suburbs is where the poverty is. In America, it's the opposite.
Oh, yeah, exactly. Because it's like New York City. You heard of places like Scarsdale, where it's multi-million-dollar mansions, like that's where all like this the rich doctors and whatever live and stuff like that. And then if you're not living in, like, let's say the Upper East Side, co-ops, everything, it's all the slums in the city. Yeah.
Right. That threw me off. And then I've been doing research on how America's suburbs, particularly in the post World War II, where they started building on the outskirts of town, and that's where they started concentrating the wealth rather than in the downtown. So that's what I just found that really interesting. I don't know how we got on that. How we got on to. I think I was saying
French women, and I was like already. I was all down with talking about that. Yeah. But it's funny though. I did remember watching a documentary, not a documentary. What do you call this? Like a symposium where a bunch of people talk about a bunch of guys who wrote books on World War II, and they're talking about it was about the aftermath of World War II. And one of the things that they told the American GIs, which are in the occupation of Germany, was don't fraternize. Like this is part of the Morgenthau thing. They wanted to kind of punish the German people. It was part of the denazification program and things like that. And this guy published all these letters where the officers were saying how impossible it was to keep they said the American GIs and German women were like coffee and milk. They just went together. Like it was impossible to stop it from happening. And they said, they said it was like, and it was really funny because one of the letters he goes, unlike the frogs, meaning the French, he literally said frogs in the letter.
Yeah.
Like the French, the German and American women just seemed to it was kind of like magnets. Like we no matter what we do, we can't stop it. Like the Americans.
Yeah. If you read the Band of Brothers book, one of the things that he noted is that the Americans got along best with the German people than they did. Now, there's a couple of things that he caveats that with, but he said that culturally, and this is why I was getting back at too, it would be really weird to see a Cold War between America and Germany. The Americans found the Germans to be much more like them than they did the English or the French. They felt like the English were
even the English. That's true. Even the English, like the Germans, because if you read Patton's letters to his wife, do you remember that? Did you?
I don't remember. Well, Patton had. Don't ever tell a Russian about what Patton thought of Russians.
Well, yeah, there are all these conspiracy theories that's why they, Patton had his way, he was.
They would have started. That's another. That was another interesting topic for a podcast. Would be if Patton had gotten his way and they'd actually start a war with Russia.
Yeah, well, didn't Patton after the Germans surrendered, Patton was put in charge of the German POWs, and he actually had them doing drills and shit. Like he was like,
I don't remember that. I just remember where he was very adamant, and I've talked with a Russian writer about how later generations of Russians wish that they had gone and taken the rest of Europe to avoid the Cold War. And I was thinking about how if that attitude had been among the Russians at the time and Patton's, pushing for war, that could have actually potentially caused some sort of a rift. I think that the problem is that I think everybody was just ready to be done. The only people who wanted to fight, apparently, and I was reading about this in the Band of Brothers book, is that the only people who wanted to keep fighting were the Germans. They were like, okay, great. Now let's go fight the Bolsheviks. And the Americans were like, we want to go home. I was always fascinated. I'm not sure if you watched that part of the Band of Brothers. There's that scene where Winters is meeting he's clearly Prussian. You can kind of you can tell he's this very emotionally dispassionate.
Didn't he, like a VON before his last name? Anyway, go ahead.
Yeah, he's the one who surrender. He offers his pistol as a surrender to Winters, and Winters allows him to keep his firearms. And,
they didn't have what was Sobel? Was that the name of the Jewish guy in Band of Brothers?
The guy from Friends.
Yeah, they said, well, he's not too keen on surrendering to a Jewish guy. Could you have?
No, it was a corporal. No, it was a corporal. He didn't want to surrender to a corporal. He wanted, and that was another general. That was the general who ended up giving that speech at the end.
Yeah, that's
for
I
that.
always thought that was one of the things I was surprised that the censors let slip past was the speech that the general gave to the German general gave to his troops was actually the
Right.
speech meant for all of the allies. Like that, do you remember like that was kind of the speech meant surrender, we fought hard, we
Yeah,
very
yeah.
poignant speech, but it came from the lips of a Nazi general.
I think that the reason for that is because he was Prussian, and the Prussians, from what I've read and just my general gist of them, is they were just seen as being different. They weren't so much ideological as they were just soldiers. So the war itself wasn't really like it wasn't. They just wanted to fight. That's why it's like, okay, great, this war's over. We want to go fight another war, or whatever it is. He even made that comment. The Prussian commander said that to Winters. He goes, I wonder what will become of us when there are no further wars to occupy us. Like he's clearly having kind of not an identity crisis, but like, what do I do with my life now? Whereas Winters is like, I don't want to fight. I'm not.
I want to go home and like raise a family.
Yeah, he wants to go home to a farm out in the middle of nowhere, and the Prussians like, well, how? Like, wait a minute, what do I? It's like a car with no roads or something like that. So I think that the Prussians always struck me as being very. They don't. Their ideology is just conflict. It probably came from what's his name, Frederick the Great, where they just wanted to fight and they wanted to be good at what they were doing, but they didn't really have any ideological reasons for fighting. Whereas other people, you got to compel them by some sort of moral reason. Whereas there's a lot of other guys where I just want to fight. Like I'm a soldier. I'm not particularly keen on why we're fighting. That's not my job or anything like that.
No, that's interesting. I was having a flashback to the fact that the British employed the Hessians, who were Prussian.
Yes,
right?
yes, the Hessians.
Yeah. Well, they just didn't.
Yeah.
They didn't necessarily weren't fighting for a ideology or religion or for land per se. They were fighting because that's what they did. They were bred to fight.
Right. Yeah. Of course, the moral of that lesson is always be awake on Christmas Day.
Yeah. Well, yeah, George Washington for all his well, anyway, yeah, that was. But anyway, thank you for everybody that listens. We're gonna end it here because we've been going on a long time and it's been really great. It's been a lot of fun, TJ. Thank you so much. But before we go, TJ, you got to tell everybody where they can find you. Go ahead.
Oh, yeah, you can find me at tjmartinell.com. It's going to have links to my podcast, to all my different books and other stuff. I have a new book that came out from Terror House Press. Is called The Pilgrim's Digress. Is very relevant to what's going on now. So, and it's not a long read. It's like 100 pages. So, recommend that you read it and leave a review.
Okay, thank you very much. So check him out, and everybody who listened, if you like this, please share it, comment on it, because as time allows, TJ and I will do more of these, and we will read your suggestions, and hopefully, if there's a specific battle or time in history you want us to do a stream on, we will. So I'd greatly appreciate that. Anyway, everybody, take care and good night.